Is there an on button right there?
Hello. How's everybody doing?
Is he?
Do we have a lot of full bellies? All right. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming back from lunch. We're going to continue with our program here. Next presentation is called A Functional Pathway from Millennium to Koha. We're going to have Chris Todd, who is the Cataloging and Systems Librarian at the University of Pittsburgh Barco Law Library, talking about this subject. So everyone please welcome Chris.
We were talking just before I came up. I could have just as easily called it an ugly pathway from Millennium to Millennium to Koha, because it is a little bit on the ugly side. So real quick, is this coming through all right? I know people have been struggling with this earlier in the day. So I'm a librarian at the University of Pittsburgh in the Barco Law Library. But what I'm going to be talking about today is an in-house data migration we did from Millennium to Koha. This technique that I'm going to share was developed by me and another librarian while we were both working in the U.S. Northern Mariana Islands. You might be wondering where that is. I'll get into it in a second. So really, I'm talking about the data migration. When I say it was fully in-house, I mean we didn't have any contractors. We had very little input from IT. We were two humanities librarians. We had no background in any of this. I think I had to Google what a CSV was when we first started. So we were starting very flat-footed. One of the big advantages we had is we were a very small library. So this technique we used to move just under 50,000 records in under 2 months. That 2-month figure, though, includes planning, execution, and quality control of this process. So there are some extreme limits on what I'm about to show you. This is really for small libraries only. So especially libraries with a limited budget, we did this for $0. If we had more money, we would have done a few things differently, but we did not. So this is how we approached it. We also, this technique is also good for librarians with very little expertise or no one they can lean on for this, because we didn't do anything all that complicated. And finally, this works if you do not have any sort of catalog level export feature, which Millennium famously doesn't have, and they do have the data exchange module, and ours didn't work. So a more traditional approach to doing this would be, you would use the native list creator feature to generate manageable lists of MARC records, which you would send to that data exchange module and start extracting your MARC records. So we didn't have it. It was never brought online. We'd had our system in place for about 3 or 4 years, and we had no way to bring it back. So instead, we used that list creator feature as our catalog level export tool. What that looks like, here's just sort of a top-down overview, is we started with formatted MARC records in Millennium, which we then exported as plain text values. We caught that in Notepad++. That's the little, I think it's a chameleon. I've been thinking of it as a tree frog, but I just realized it has a tail. So it's some type of lizard. From there, we went into Apache Openoffice, where we heavily formatted our data, cleaned up some of our legacy data issues, and exported it as a CSV. From there, we went to MARC Edit, where we crosswalked everything back into MARC format, and finally used the bulk uploader to get it into Koha. Now, why did we take such a roundabout process? That is highly influenced by our location. So all this happened on Saipan. Saipan is the principal island of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. The acronym for that is CNMI. I'm from Kentucky, and so I will say CNMI on you a few times. So if you catch me doing that, that's what I'm saying. So this is a 14-island archipelago. It's been a U.S. territory since 1978. Basically, the easiest way to think of it is as a similar political relationship with the U.S. as Puerto Rico. So it's an overseas unincorporated commonwealth. A very quick sort of historical snapshot. It was first settled in 1500 BCE by the Chamorro people as part of the Austronesian diaspora. There's, like much of the Pacific, there's a long and brutal colonial history, starting with the Spanish who arrived in 1521, followed by the German Empire, the Japanese Empire, and finally the U.S. in 1942. All indigenous residents are U.S. citizens, and they are not allowed to vote in any federal elections. They also have a non-voting representative in Congress. To put it in a global perspective, about right there is the 15th parallel, so it's about halfway between Japan and Australia. If I zoom in any more, it's a lot of blue. So more specifically, this all takes place at the Northern Marianas College. This is a U.S. accredited community college, largely serving the indigenous community. The library itself was built in 1943 during the US invasion of Saipan as a Navy hospital, and we still use it today as a library. Now, one of the main reasons why this data migration was so important is our OPAC was the primary finding aid for the land records for the entire Commonwealth. So the government depended on us to have that information, the residents depended on us to have that information, and land rights is a big deal in the Pacific. So there was a lot of eyes on this, and we had to get it right the first time. So our starting point was Millennium. Millennium, I think a lot of my feelings are sort of encapsulated in that image. But so it was left in an out-of-the-box state, basically. Everything was migrated and installed by off-island contractors. There was very little input by the library personnel when the contractors left. The only 3 people that had training also left within the next couple of years, so that by the time I got there in 2013, we'd had it for 4 years, and just the functionality was very low. We couldn't really get it to do anything besides the few basic features that it could handle. Now, another issue that we had was money. I can't get into our services contracts with Innovative, the owners of Millennium, but I can say that we were spending over 50% of our budget just on our ILS. So that was a big problem. Our hand kind of got forced when we were contacted by Innovative, and they told us that they were raising our fees effective in 3 months. So the clock was ticking the second we got that letter. We just sort of tore into it, right? We knew we were migrating, we knew we were going open source, because our first criteria is we had $0. We'd already paid them for that year, so we didn't really have any money to play around with at all. It was followed by the incredibly short deadline. The other major issue was our limited ILS skills. As I mentioned, this was 2 humanities librarians who really didn't know what we were doing. So we started this process from the way a librarian would start it, right? You do a lit review. Now, part of our lit review was, one of the reasons why that was so hard was some of the connectivity issues we had in the Northern Marianas, which is also the reason why we weren't considering a cloud-based ILS. So I didn't know this before relocating, but most international internet connections travel through this network of subsea cables. So if you look at the Eastern US and Western Europe, there's a lot of redundancies. There's any number of cables running from one point to another. So if something happens to one of those cables, that traffic can be rerouted. That's how you get these strong international connections. Now, in the Northern Marianas, things worked a little bit differently. So we had one cable that was running from Guam. Now, Guam, you can kind of see those shadows. Those are those redundancies. Because Guam was connected to the Philippines, Australia, Japan, and to the US mainland through Hawaii. We had that one connection through Guam. So Saipan, it's the largest island, it's the most populous island, but it's actually got some of the slowest internet in the Commonwealth because that cable stops at 2 smaller islands before reaching Saipan. Now, when your telecommunication system is set up like this, if anything happens to that cable, everything goes down. Banking is done, there's no phones, there's no internet. It is a disaster. And that's exactly what happened in 2015. So the cable severed between Tinian and Saipan. So we were left without, we became a cash economy instantly because there was no more banks, basically. From then, we started getting international aid to get our communications back online, but when they did come back, it was a very different scenario. I think the Marianas Variety headline here sums it up quite well. Internet is back, sort of. So before the cable broke, we were getting about double dial-up speeds. For perspective. Our internet was even slower after the cable was repaired. So we were definitely not looking at a cloud-based ILS. So of course we landed on Koha. This is something we could locally host. There was a great deal of freely available training materials. And there's also an active community online, which we took great advantage of at all points in our migration. Another benefit of Koha was the competitive third-place market, the competitive third-party marketplace for support. We didn't end up going this route, but it was important for us to know that that was an option because we were with Innovative, it was them or nothing. So the first step was the data migration. We had no idea where to start because of our very limited internet. We couldn't do that much of a lit review in the first place. We were basically text-only browsing. So we were digging through databases trying to find any successful migrations from point A to point B. We landed on this article. Detailing the New York University Health Sciences migration from Millennium to Koha. This is the only complete migration sort of narrative that we found. Now, New York University and Northern Marianas College are very different institutions, right? They've got a lot of IT. They've got librarians that are trained in this thing. They had access to a lot more advanced techniques than we did out at Saipan. Now, one of the reasons why this was so important for us is the author, Ian Walls, explored several different pathways and said why they didn't use them. But we focused in on one of the rejected pathways. A quote from the article was, "Exporting as a list was not feasible due to the complexity of completely capturing all the marked fields in a comma delimited format." Now that's totally accurate, that's not feasible. But it did get us thinking, what if we didn't try to export MARC records, and instead try to export plain text data that we could put together sort of daisy chain applications. If we had enough workarounds in place, we could reconstitute those MARC records on the other end and upload them to Koha. So this changed the way we were thinking. We stopped focusing on MARC records per se and started thinking of what we had as data that we could manipulate, that we were in control of. So in order to get this done, we focused in on 4 distinct stages. So preparation is going to be getting quality control of our information while we're still within Millennium. Export is just getting that plain text data outside of Millennium environment, but also not losing track of what's what. Mapping is the crosswalk I mentioned, turning all of that data back into MARC tags, basically. And upload is getting everything into the code. So jumping right in, so preparation for us, this was weeding, quality control, and then partitioning our server. As we started getting into our data, trying to figure out what we had, we found all kinds of legacy data issues. Some of that was caused by faulty migrations in the past. Some of it was caused by local cataloging that didn't adhere to any objective cataloging standards. And the good thing about these is a lot of them were done in batches, so we can isolate them based on load date and address them as we found them. Now this is where IT started stepping in. They partitioned our extant ILS server, and that let us run Millennium and Koha concurrently so we could test our process and make sure we weren't missing anything. Get into the export phase. Now since we weren't pulling out full MARC records, we were going to lose some of our data, and we resigned to that. So our first thought was we looked at LOC standards to figure out what's the minimum fields we have to have, what constitutes a minimally acceptable MARC record, if you will. We took that information and used it to create a template in that native list creator feature I mentioned before, and then we started pulling out that plain text data and just started playing around with that export. Now this is where vigilance really comes in, because once you break that MARC formatting, it's very hard to tell what you have. So we were lucky that there's only 2 people working on this, because if we were a bigger institution, I feel like it would have been a lot easier to scramble that data. Now, an issue we came up against very quickly was that export feature. It wants to separate everything from a comma, right? That's the heart of the CSV convention. So we have a lot of plain text commas in bibliographic records and author fields and title fields. So we needed something that would be unique. We needed a unique delimiting character. We focused in on the % sign because it didn't appear anywhere in our records. So we were able to set that instead of the comma in our CSV. We've got some of my export data here, and I'm highlighting all the percents to show where those tabs would fall. And this is a pretty cumbersome, pretty ugly technique, but it does preserve those plain text commas. Getting into the mapping phase. This was the longest and most complicated. So we had to use 3 or 4 different programs just to get this part done. So our deconstructed MARC records were outside Millennium. We need to get them back into a MARC format. We started with Notepad++. Really, we were just lightly formatting the information and visually scanning to see if there was any export errors. We started using regular expressions, something else I knew nothing about before I started this. If you're not familiar, they're basically advanced wildcard characters that you can identify, and especially when used with Control-H, find and replace, you can identify and alter like massive amounts of data. Moving on to Openoffice Calc, we use even more regular expressions to clean things up. We use them so much we started saying regex, right? We got cool with it. So again, every time we move to a different system, we have to set that % character, that delimiting character, when we export and when we import. So it's one of the many sort of rickety parts of this process. While we were leaving, as our data was leaving, we started to establish that crosswalk from our CSV file. Here's a quick snapshot of our crosswalk table. Really, we're just taking what we had with Millennium, kind of just a plain description of what it is, and then the Koha compliant MARC tag on the other side. Now, this was pretty simple. A lot of it was one-to-one, some of it wasn't. Now, for the title field, we did have a few issues where it separated all, instead of separating the subfields, it combined everything. So we had to tease that out. as we moved our data between the different systems. The last stop in our mapping phase is mark edit, and I challenge anyone to find something more visual than that to represent mark edit. There's not much to it. This is where we started to associate each piece of information with those mark tags. This is where that table you saw, this is where that gets applied. One thing that was really useful about this is it allowed us to, allowed us to save our arguments as an external file so we could apply them to other sets of data, because we did this in groups of 10,000 records. And so after the first one proved successful, we were able to largely automate this. Finally, to the upload, this was fairly straightforward. We read the Koha manual and followed the rules, and everything worked well. The only extra step we added is we tested our records using the Koha sandbox demo provided by Bywater, today's host. And this was really useful for us because it gave us a chance to see what our records would look like through an OPAC and mess with the ILS side without putting potentially dirty data into a clean installation of Koha. Finally, we used a similar technique. We went back to the beginning and started extracting all of our patron information. And we passed them through the same process and finally into Koha. At this point, our process was successful. There was a big angry red asterisk at the end of success because there's a few things to keep in mind. One of which is that everything you've seen is fundamentally risky, right? Every time a new program opens your data, there's a chance for it to alter it somehow. It can either alter the source information or it can alter the formatting. Either way, you're going to end up with something you didn't count on. So vigilance is extremely crucial for anyone considering this technique or a similar technique. Another issue we had was this technique doesn't move item statuses. So we came up with a workaround. Again, we're looking at such a small batch of records, we were able to just run stock reports to identify which records were checked out, damaged, lost, things like that, and then just manually correct them after everything was in Koha. Final issue that this technique produces is that it doesn't do anything to migrate patron finds. And this one we were aware of before we started because our pre-migration lit review, we noticed most librarians talking about there wasn't an easy or accurate way to capture patron finds with some of these workarounds. So instead of coming up with another workaround, we just didn't do it. So what we did is we granted a general amnesty basically. We're like, if you've returned your book, we're waiving your fine. We contacted the students, let them know that. We also said if you have a book that's outstanding, bring it back and we'll cut your fine in half. So this was a way to sort of bribe the students into getting interested in the new ILS, or just to create a degree of excitement, we'll say, instead of bribing students. But it worked, and we got a lot of our books back as well. Now, there's a few final things to keep in mind. If anyone is considering doing this technique, one of the things I would always say for really anything you're doing is maintain that positive relationship with IT. Because we tried to place very little of the burden on IT. We asked them to do two things. It was to partition our server and to install Koha. Everything else we took care of, the two librarians. Now what that did was it created a much more positive working environment with IT because we came to them as collaborators and not as looking to them to provide us with a service necessarily. And that good interaction carried on into later projects as well. Something else I would advise is to consider using OpenRefine. OpenRefine was available to us back then, but we didn't know it. It's a web-based application, which we couldn't have used if we did know about it. So it's a data cleanup utility. It functions a lot like a spreadsheet, but it has a lot of extended functionality as well. This is how it would slot into our process. So these two programs here handling the text file and the CSV file, I would replace them both with OpenRefine. So those plain text exports straight from Millennium, I would take them in OpenRefine and start our data transformations there. One of the big benefits about using OpenRefine is that all of your arguments can be saved as a JSON file, JavaScript object notation file, and they can be applied to later data sets, which we certainly would have used. And furthermore, it can be shared with other libraries considering a similar technique. So right now, instead of waving my arms and telling you about how we did it, I just have a link to our JSON file and encourage people to use that. Now, as I'm starting to wrap this up, I will say that our small size was a major advantage. That was really the only reason we were able to do this the way we did. Part of that is that there was very little bureaucracy. We didn't have to ask for a lot of permission. We kind of just did it. The small set of records helped a lot as well because some of those manual workarounds don't work when you have a massive collection. So right now I'm at the University of Pittsburgh. We're looking to start migrating or changing our ILS. We have 7 million records. You're not going to do this for a system with 7 million records. Something else to keep in mind is that the flexibility and community around Koha was really the only reason this would have happened, because just having access to any sort of training materials, having people to talk with, having articles to find when we did a lit review really made this happen. Finally, this is an incredibly stripped down process put together by outsiders. So there's a lot that can be improved in here, but we did get this to work and it got us to where we were going. So hopefully librarians with us, like librarians from smaller institutions, there's something in here that can work for you and something that can get you into that new ILS. With that, I'm open for questions. I've got a list of all the applications we use up there as well.
Actually, this isn't so much a question as a comment, but I'll throw in a question. You have the XKCD regular expressions t-shirt.
I do not, no.
See me after.
Excellent, thank you.
But I did something very much like what you did, except my library had half the technical staff to work on it, me. And one of the great things about Koha that I've noticed is you can do this. And after a while, it starts making sense. I just got a spare computer and started installing and reinstalling and reinstalling, and eventually I got it right. So yeah, and we also have a very small library, maybe 20,000 records at the most, circulation of 3 books a day. Don't do this in a big library, but it's quite possible. Anybody can. If I can, you can.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that. And that's and the feeling you're talking about, that's exactly how we felt too. And by doing this ourselves, by really rolling up our sleeves, our whole library has a staff of 4 people. And so by the end of it, everyone was majorly involved in this. So there was that sense of responsibility and knowledge. So we were able to troubleshoot our own system. So there was a lot of confidence around it afterwards, which we really wouldn't have had if we had done this a different way, namely having someone do it for us.
Also, we're saving about $10,000 a year from our previous system, though they're also spending it on sending me to Koha US conferences.
Heck yeah.
I think I know the answer to this question because you haven't talked about it, but what did you elect to do with all of your old acquisitions data or any of your serials data that you might have had with regard to check-ins or any of the other ancillary record types that an event used to maintain?
That's a very easy to answer. We didn't have that data. So we were not concerned with it because we didn't have it. And that's one of the reasons why this technique worked for us, because if we had a more robust functioning system, we couldn't have done this. I think there's a question up here.
Did your common delimited export allow multiple characters as a value for the export for the delimited?
Yeah, we were able to set it to whatever we wanted. We focused in on percent just because it's something that was easy enough to remember and wasn't in any of our records.
But you could have used three characters where the individual characters might have been in a combination of 3 characters as a delimiter. Or some such thing, where the individual characters might have been in the records, but the combination would have been.
That's true. That's definitely the type of computer science thinking that we just didn't have at our disposal. But thank you for recommending that. If there's no more questions, I want to point to, I published this technique earlier this year in Digital Library Perspectives. There's a link to that right there. That is an Emerald journal, so it's behind a paywall. So if you don't have institutional access, there's another link to an open access version of that on the University of Pittsburgh Institutional Repository. And with that, thank you very much.